Hey, this is Notser, and we're taking a look at the Tier 8 mainline battleships. Game in the background is the Amagi. I have the recommended modules and commander skills to the right, with a general comparison at the bottom of the screen, and we're going to talk about survivability potential. Overall, the battleships have within 9,000 hit points at Tier 8, with the Bismarck having the most, Monarch having the least. The general gameplay loop here is that the Monarch's low outer layer is more vulnerable to high explosive and fire. It will recover that, whereas the Germans rely more on high explosive shattering on the extra high armor zones near the waterline of the bow and stern. And they just in general, their armor is situated in such a way that you might break through one layer or get through, but you're not going to be as successful finding that citadel as maybe you would be against the Amagi or the Roma. Note the torpedo protection. Amagi has the best at 45% of the main line. There are premiums that have better, with the North Carolina having the least 21%. That is abysmal. And that should inform how you're sailing. Something like the Amagi would be more willing to take torpedoes on the broadside because they actually have a significant amount of mitigation, whereas the North Carolina is really an all-or-nothing situation. It's going to hurt regardless if it hits. And in general, to all of them, don't take torpedoes on the bow and stern. It'll cause a flood 100% of the time and do full damage. Now, as far as guns are concerned, this tier is pretty fair. The least amount being 8 and the most being 10. The gun caliber, though, is an issue, and it is an important threshold that the North Carolina and the Amagi can take advantage of, whereas the rest of these ships cannot. That threshold being 27mm bow and stern of heavy cruisers or low-tier battleships. Not Tier 8, 9, or 10, but a Tier 7 and 6. Absolutely, this particular zone could be exploited by the Amagi in the North Carolina, whereas the Bismarck, Monarch, Richelieu, and Roma, you need to shot select a little bit more precise for the superstructure when those particular targets are bow and stern on you. Reload is pretty comparable as well, most of them being 30 seconds, with the Bismarck and Monarch being a little bit quicker. Turret traverse base is, once again, very comparable. My threshold to decide if I'm going to invest in expert marksman is 36 seconds. So in this example, Amagi, Monarch, and North Carolina would have me investing in expert marksman. Bismarck, Richelieu, and Roma, I would actually first invest in adrenaline rush, which ends up offering a little bit of extra damage when you take damage. That should be your goal. You should be mitigating it and helping your team. As far as accuracy is concerned, there's a couple stats that everyone cares about. Sigma, range of the guns, dispersion, and gun velocity. I didn't include gun velocity because it depends on the shell type, but I'll try and paint a picture for you, and you can obviously do more research. This is to just make sure that you have a general understanding of what to expect. And in general, all the battleships have pretty comparable accuracy with a couple exceptions, mainly being North Carolina and Amagi. North Carolina has a 2.0 Sigma. Sigma dictates the consistency of the shell to land near the center of the crosshair. The higher the number, the more consistent. And the Amagi, the Japanese battleships, maintain shot dispersion over distance far better than any other branch in the game currently. And it shows 20 kilometers, 227 meter dispersion. That's the base stat. It can be improved. And if we compare it to something like the Roma, who has 18.1 kilometer range, it has a maximum dispersion of 243 meters. And every single battleship has a different vertical/horizontal. These numbers are tailored to the trait of the ships. You've got to really play them to identify it. But in general, North Carolina, very consistent over range, and this makes it a top pick for competitive. Other top picks would honestly be Alabama, very similar to the North Carolina, better torpedo protection. But let's say you don't want to be super awesome in the Citadel long-range accuracy department of your main guns. Maybe you want to just throw 1,000 shells at your target and overwhelm them with the amount of fire that is sticking to their ship. Then you want to take a look at the Germans and the French. Bismarck and Richelieu, they have the highest base secondary gun range, 7.5 with the Bismarck, 7 kilometers for the Richelieu. You can invest in secondary gun range with your modules and commander skills, and you can get it out to 11.3 for the Bismarck, 10.6 for the Richelieu. You'll notice that all the other battleships in the main branch, I didn't use something like the Massachusetts because it's easier to look at the main branch and then take slight tweaks to that branch itself. Obviously, North Carolina is not a secondary build, but it does have 127mm guns, and that is exactly what is equipped to the Massachusetts with better range. I love secondary builds. You absolutely feel like you're just throwing everything at the enemy, and generally speaking, the ships that are secondary focused have only high explosive. You'll note that all of the long-range secondaries are firing exclusively high explosive. You want to set the target on fire, and you want the shell to do damage. You may invest in inertia fuse high explosive for that. As far as AA is concerned, I've decided to compare the short, medium, and long-range auras of each respectable battleship, and you'll notice that some are better than others. Amagi doesn't even have a short-range aura, whereas the North Carolina's long-range aura is the highest by far, with 151 damage per second. The long-range aura is very important to consider because this is the number that will be doubled if you invest in manual AA. It's a level 4 skill, and generally that doesn't really happen right now. CVs are on life support, but when the rework comes, they're going to be adjusting the AA protection value so it remains comparable. Something like the North Carolina will always be the best mainline battleship for AA protection. Because of that, you can invest even more and become just a kill box for CVs that are trying to send their fighters over you. If you're something like the Monarch or the Richelieu, you'll notice that the long-range aura is pathetic. 64 damage per second. It only gets doubled to 128 damage per second. Clearly, it's not even in the same ballpark as the North Carolina, so it's important to recognize that North Carolina and the Bismarck and even the Roma, for some extent, could theoretically invest in manual AA in a CV-fested world and be okay, whereas other battleships, they need to rely more on teammates. As far as maneuverability is concerned, pretty much every battleship at this tier is pretty quick, the slowest being the North Carolina with a base speed of 27.5 knots, the fastest being the Richelieu at 32 knots. Pretty much all these battleships can definitely keep up with the flank. There's not a Colorado scenario. Boy, the Americans are very happy to not have the Colorado's 21 knot speed. 27.5 is just plenty. The turn radius for the ships is very comparable, with the North Carolina being the most tight at 760 meters, and the Amagi, no surprise there, at 870 meter radius turn. The rudders are, pretty responsive. They're within 2 seconds of each other. Really, what's important about the maneuverability is all the ships feel very comparable. They can perform their role very well. They can keep up with the fleet. They have good ability to avoid torpedoes in general. Their rudder is pretty responsive. You could decide to invest more in that, or you could decide to invest in more protection from floods and fires, which is rampant everywhere. And, the best way to avoid floods and fires is to kill the targets or remain undetected. It's really that simple. It's not pretty, but that's the reality we're in right now. Now, as far as concealment is concerned, I have the surface concealment, base, and fully concealed. And I also have the air, base, and fully concealed. And out of all these battleships, the Monarch is the best concealed at 10.9. Roma is right there at 11.2. And the worst concealed battleship is Amagi at 13 kilometers. Now that's actually pretty bad now that they've buffed the Izumo. The Izumo, I think, is 12.9. So the tier 9 actually has better concealment in the Japanese branch than Amagi. And pretty much every battleship, whenever it fires from smoke, well, you can guess this, it's really hard to conceal the battleship firing from smoke. You're not really going to do that ever. Maybe you're coming back to the game and that's the meta that existed. You're spotted from a mile away. So, yeah. Generally, Monarch, North Carolina have a good time and the Roma of dropping off detection, firing in between shots. Amagi, Richelieu, Bismarck, not so much. And honestly, if you're investing in a secondary build, you probably are investing fully. You're not going to get the kind of concealment on those two ships as maybe you're dreaming of. Overall, Tier 8 battleships offer a lot of gameplay variety. They're not super high that it's too expensive to run. It's actually very enjoyable to play all the battleships. I hope that this was informative, interesting for you. If you didn't pay attention, I had my recommended builds on the right side for all of the gameplay that you saw today. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll catch you next time.